Okay, today we're going to talk about 6.3, Adolescence. The objective for today is you will be able to apply Kohlberg's theory of moral development to a series of scenarios. So, adolescence. Stanley Hall is the one to define adolescence, and he did so in 1904 and said it starts at puberty. And ends at the start of adulthood. So, a very, scientific definition right there, but just kind of, it never used to have adolescence, right? It was like you were a child and then you were an adult. So there is this new concept of, there's this weird phase in between that. What happens during your development is you go through puberty, right? And puberty is defined as a rapid physical growth, physiological changes. So this is going to be changes in your body, and sexual maturity. And sexual maturity happens in two ways. First, you have primary sex characteristics, and these is going to be anything you need for reproduction. And then secondary sex characteristics is going to be a non-reproduction. So more muscle growth, right? Would be a secondary sex characteristics. Timing of puberty is important. If it happens too early for girls, it's bad. If it happens too late for boys, it is bad. Girls have the menarche, which is your first period. And boys have the spermarche, which is the first ejaculation. Brain development in teenagers. Look at this over here. This is so fascinating. I really want you to pay attention to this. So notice that this color is less developed. This color is more developed. Where are you guys right now? Most of you are right around here. You have a lot of this part of the brain that is less developed, so it is very sensitive to the effect of drugs. That is why most alcohol and drugs are legal at after the age of 21, because now we see that part of the brain is much more developed. This is, for most teenagers, what the brain looks like. So in 2005, because of this information right here, the Supreme Court ruled that juvenile death penalties were unconstitutional because of the lack of brain development. So if you are ruled a juvenile, you cannot be given the death penalty. Kohlberg came up with some moral development. You're going to need to know this for your assignment today, but you can use the text as well. There's a lot of great information in there. Pre-conventional is before the age of 9. This is the idea that you have self-interest and that you obey rules to either avoid punishment or gain rewards. Conventional morality is going to be your early adolescence, is where you start caring for others. So you kind of have some more empathy, more compassion, and you still want to uphold laws and social rules. So social starts to fall in here. And then you have post-conventional morality. And this is going to be abstract reasoning, self-defined, basic ethical principles. For example, you may talk to some Americans about what's happening on the border, right? Yes, people are entering the country illegally, but does that mean that we have the right to separate families? That would be post-conventional morality, right? And just because you may be in early adolescence doesn't mean that you still don't understand post-conventional morality, because there may be things that you may say, or even as a young child, but that's not right, that's not fair. because we do have some aspect of morality. A psychologist by the name of Jonathan Haiditz did what we call the social institutionist account of morality. Moral feelings precede moral reasoning. So moral feelings precede moral reasoning. The example that he gave is stealing household goods and foods after a natural disaster. You may not typically steal, but if there was a natural disaster, you may feel the need to do that. Okay, so you are going to need to know each one of these stages for Erickson. So make sure that you either are writing this down or annotating along with me. So the first stage is going to be basic trust. And for infants, so the first stage is going to be basic trust versus mistrust. Essentially, is your parent meeting basic needs? The second is autonomy, which means individuality, versus shame and doubt. So do they kind of become their own person or feel very guilty or shameful about who they are? The third stage is initiative. Does the preschooler learn to take initiatives to do things on their own? Or do they, again, kind of feel guilty about things and not want to do things on their own? 4 is industry. Are they learning to discover and feel confident about their discoveries, or do they feel inferior to their peers? 5 is identity. Have you figured out and identified who you are as a person, or are you still confused about who you are and where you're supposed to be going? 6 is intimacy. Can you develop intimate relationships with others? That does not mean just sexual. It can be intimate with a good friend, meaning that you have a level of comfort where you feel like you can tell them anything and they trust their judgment. Or isolation, do you prefer to be by yourself? And by yourself doesn't necessarily mean that you're secluded in your own home, but that you're not close with anybody in one person in particular. Middle age, generativity versus stagnation. Do you feel like you are accomplishing things, or do you feel like you're kind of stuck in kind of almost like a midlife crisis? And then finally, the last stage is 8. Ego integrity. You look back on your life with happiness and joy, proud of what you've accomplished and what your children have accomplished, or despair. Do you look back and have negative feelings? Okay, so identity versus James Marcia. James Marcia said that there was 4 types or 4 steps to identity. So we have 1, 2, 3, and 4. Identity diffusion is that you have yet to find your own identity. Identity foreclosure is that you have this sense of your own beliefs, but you still follow your parents or those around you. Identity moratorium is when you start to explore different ideas and you start to develop your own beliefs. And then identity achievement is when you finally, I have identified and acknowledged who you are. And then finally, sexual orientation. So sexual orientation, sexual attraction to either a male, female, neither, or both. Heterosexual is the opposite sex. Homosexual is the same sex. Bisexual is both. And asexual is neither. We know that there's sexual orientation is part of the brain and brain development. We know that it's genetic. Genetics play a role in sexual orientation. We know that it happens usually between 2 and 5 months of development is when the brain, things like the hypothalamus, are developing, and we see there are changes in the hypothalamus for prenatal development when it comes to gender or in sexual orientation. The hypothalamus not only deals with sexual orientation, but also gender identity. So if you think back to when we talked about gender, that is what type of gender or what gender you personally identify with, not what gender organs you are born with.